Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Mary Villas, and I'm the president of PSC Partners Canada. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, also known as Takaranto. I would like to offer a land acknowledgement, a small gesture designed to evolve and hopefully hold much more meaning than the words alone. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Thank you, and let's get started. This meeting will begin with a presentation by Dr. Veronica Miller about patient-focused drug development, followed by moderated breakout rooms for Q&A and discussion. Next slide, please. This meeting is the 8th in our series of 10 roadmap webinars. Hopefully by now you have seen this roadmap graphic. To the right are the three main stakeholders: patients, researchers, and clinicians. And on the left are the 4 topic areas that the roadmap series is covering. Before we get started with this Roadmap 201 meeting, I'd like to review the goals of roadmap, which are accelerating progress to find therapies and a cure by educating the patient community on the research landscape, broadening the researcher base, and strengthening multi-stakeholder communication, creating opportunities for researchers and clinicians to engage in meaningful discussions with an informed patient community. Thank you again for joining us, and welcome. Now I'll pass the Zoom mic to Joanne Hatchett, Medical Science Liaison at PSC Partners Seeking a Cure.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to all of tonight's participants, both first-timers and repeat attendees. The content for Drug Development 201 expands on the discussions from the December webinar. Today, we'll begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Veronica Miller, who will also have discussions with 2 of our co-facilitators, Dr. Dan Pratt and Sujal Shah. Then, you will have the privilege of meeting with our excellent co-facilitators in the breakout rooms who will answer PSC patients and caregivers questions about drug development and clinical trials, as well as additional discussion and Q&A with researchers, clinicians, and pharma who have joined us tonight. Thank you to all of our co-facilitators. Now, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Veronica Miller. Dr. Miller has a PhD in immunology. Dr. Miller is at the Berkeley School of Public Health and executive director of the Forum for Collaborative Research. She is an expert in regulatory science. PSC Partners has been an active member of the PSC Forum, which Dr. Miller launched in 2017. The PSC Forum is an international, independent, multi-stakeholder organization that identifies gaps in PSC research.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanne, for that very kind introduction. And also to Mary Villas from the very cold Toronto. And I will say welcome to everyone from a very cold Washington, D.C. tonight. So it is such an honor to be part of this webinar, especially following this incredible presentation in the December webinar by Frank Sasanowski, someone who is so involved in drug development from both the regulatory perspective and now from the advocacy perspective as well in his legal practice. And I couldn't think of anyone better to give this initial talk in December to really focus on the ABCs of drug development, how that happens with the clinical path going from phase 1 and 2 and 3, and what kind of data we're looking for, how we look at efficacy, how we look at risk. And so risk often comes in the form of adverse events that can happen, but there are also other kinds of risk that we could consider as the discussion continues. But in essence, what PSC Partners is doing with these webinars is really building this community of patients that become the informed patient community that Mary Diaz was talking about in her introductory remarks. And there's no better way, and no better way to start becoming involved as a patient and as a patient community than to learn and teach all of us. So when we are in this community with regulators and with pharmaceutical experts that know about drug development and what can happen in patients and academic researchers, that community really evolves through all of us learning from each other. And for the PSC Forum, which is part of the Forum for Collaborative Research, which I direct, we really emphasize that. We bring all the stakeholders to the table, and it really is an opportunity for all of us to learn from each other. So one thing that I would like to start off with is really emphasizing the importance of the informed patient community, and that it's not just a matter of community learning from clinicians or community learning from drug developers or regulators, but it's really for all of us to learn from each other. And when we respect our individual roles in this community that PSC Partners has formed, that is really when we can make progress, because that is when we can have the confidence to push the envelope beyond what people might consider their comfort zone, and really say, let's push the envelope together, and together break this impasse that we have seen too long with respect to drug development for PSC and other cholestatic liver diseases. So instead of giving a 30-minute talk, I was so happy to hear that PSC Partners had also invited two very, very key people in the process that will be part of this, and it will really be an engaged a conversation between the three of us. But before we get to that, I really wanted to just provide a very, very brief overview and summary of some of the points that Frank Sassanowski made during his December webinar. And that is that patient engagement and drug development can really have so many different ways of being executed. Of course, patients can participate in clinical trials, and that is, of course, something many of you may have done, but it's obviously one way to participate. But that is a little bit of a passive way, because the trial design will have been determined, the protocol will have been determined, and if the patient agrees, they can enroll in a clinical trial and be probed and tested, and all of those good things that are so much fun when we participate in clinical trials. But I think the much more important part of the patient engagement is the opportunity for patients to have input into the trial design. And this is, again, part of that process of mutual learning from each other. Because when I talk about regulatory science and when I teach at Berkeley, I always say there is no black and white. So much of drug development really is nuanced, and it is so dependent on the context that the drugs are being developed in, and the willingness of people to really understand that context, be willing to really understand it and work with that, and really use data to the most maximum efficiency possible, so that we can learn as much as possible altogether. And of course, patients can have input into the trial design directly with industry. Many companies actually have patient advisory boards that they go to when they think about a new drug or a new development program, to ask the patients, would you participate in this kind of a trial? What would make this trial acceptable to you, et cetera? And of course, the regulators learn so much from patients via patient-focused drug development meetings, but also just informal interactions between regulators and patients through different kinds of venues. And then, of course, patients can also be involved directly in the research process. You can either participate and provide your data into registries or participate in surveys, or you can actually set up these registries and natural history studies. You can participate in surveys, but you can also run surveys and develop them and get answers that will be so beneficial for everyone else that's around the PSC drug development tables. And of course, we also have talked about patient-reported outcomes and how these can be part of the drug development process. And there were some earlier webinars that PSC Partners provided that talks more specifically about what is a patient-reported outcome. So all of these are offer participation at many different levels, either by just contributing, being present, or by actually taking leadership and providing these opportunities for direct participation in the research process. And of course, the last one here is communities like PSC Partners and all of your members can then really translate that clinical research knowledge to the rest of the community. And very often you might find yourself in a situation where you are able to explain what is going on better than some of the other experts coming from academia or from industry or from the regulatory space that have not had that direct experience. So with that, I just wanted to present that as a very brief overview, picking up from where Frank Sasanowski broke off. And the rest of this will now be a conversation between the three of us. And I'm very, very honored and happy to introduce Sujal Shah. He is the president and CEO of CymaBay, and one of the companies very actively involved in fairly far advanced clinical research for a drug for drugs to treat PSC. And also equally honored and happy to introduce Daniel Pratt. Dr. Pratt he's the assistant professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School and clinical director of the liver transplantation and director of the Autoimmune and Cholestatic Liver Center at the Mass General Hospitals. So welcome to both of you. And it will be a very interesting conversation. And I will depend on our PSC Partners moderators to give us the sign when it will be time to wrap up. I know we don't have all of that much time. So let's get started with you, Dan, if we can. Maybe from your perspective, if you could just sort of say a few words about your experience in clinical research in the PSC and other cholestatic liver diseases space, and your appreciation for the need to have patient input directly to you and your colleagues doing the research. So let's start at that sort of research, a clinical researcher level before we go up to protocol design, et cetera. What does it mean to you to have patient engagement?
Right. I mean, I think that is the most essential part of this. The PSC patients are an extremely motivated group for obvious reasons, as this is a disease we're still struggling with, both to understand the etiology, much less understand effective therapies. Their engagement is essential because as a rare disease, without active engagement from the PSC patient population, it would be impossible to put together some of these clinical trials. And as it is, it can be a struggle. Which is why with rare diseases, it's essential to have things like PSC Partners helping as well. Because that engagement, you're absolutely right, Dr. Miller, that is absolutely essential to success.
Mm-hmm. And how do you find that engagement? How does that engagement come to you directly at the clinical research site?
Well, yes. I mean, I have, many years ago, I started the registry at Mass General. So I'm blessed to have a large patient population. of PSC patients. And it's actually a wonderful group to work with, despite the fact that there are so many unknowns. They are often, as you mentioned, they're super educated. This is a two-way street. There's a lot of learning that goes on both sides. But it's not a challenge to engage the PSC patients.
That's very good. That's been my experience as well. So Sujal, let's go to you. And as the president and CEO of one of the major companies in this field, I'm not talking major in terms of company size and the larger pharmaceutical space, but in the PSC field, you are one of the very committed companies, and you come from my previous conversations with you. I know you come with such a committed heart, to the situation and to this patient population. Where do you go to find patient engagement? What helps you when you talk with your clinical research team?
Well, Veronica, I appreciate, first of all, having the opportunity to participate today. I should clarify a couple of things, though, at the outset. CymaBay's most advanced program today is in phase 3 for patients with primary biliary cholangitis, or PBC. But we are absolutely an organization that's committed, to the patients that we're evaluating our lead program in. And, generally speaking, we're committed broadly to the cholestatic disease patient population. And PSC is an area of significant unmet need. And even as CymaBay currently is not conducting a clinical study, the interest is there. And the interest is there to even support many of my colleagues that are on the call today. And I think what I'd say the most is I've had a chance to get to know, the group here over many years at PSC Partners. And all they had to do is ask me to participate, and I can't say no, frankly. And it's a message to highlight that this is personal for all of us. Of course, it's personal for patients. And, the importance of learning your stories, the importance for us to make this, not just a professional endeavor, but to make it a personal endeavor is quite critical, because it becomes, all of our purpose together. And that partnership, I think, is absolutely critical. There was a time in which we actually had initiated a study in PSC patients, a phase 2 study that terminated early. But in that process, we took our protocol to PSC Partners. And so for patients to have an opportunity to participate through an advocacy group like PSC Partners, that's a methodology in which we get to hear that voice. We had an opportunity, again, to share our protocol even before the protocol was finalized, to gather input from PSC Partners. And so, I think these advocacy groups are essential as a conduit for us to learn from. We partner with folks like Dr. Pratt, of course, daily as well. And to learn through Dr. Pratt the patient experience is also just another means. There's never a single way for patients, I think, to get their stories, their patient experience through to those of us running clinical studies. I think there are many of these multiple avenues.
Right. And that interaction between the pharmaceutical sector and the clinical research sector, like Dr. Pratt and his team at Harvard, is so important as well. So what would you, if you had your wish list of patient engagement for, and I'm going back to you, Sujal, is in your company, in your clinical research team. I mean, obviously, you're very interactive with PSC Partners and know about their patient-focused drug development. But what would really help you more on a day-to-day basis as you make your decisions? Where to take your program to? I mean, we all recognize the huge unmet medical need of PSC patients. But what else could patients do to really contribute to the process, to help you de-risk decisions regarding which direction you would take your program in?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously participation in clinical trials is essential, as Dr. Pratt had mentioned, to the work that we do. But that's a decision that obviously has to be appropriate for the patient, their family, and of course, their caregivers. And we know that's not an easy decision, but obviously that's one avenue. But you highlight it right here on this slide. I think all of us in the industry are leveraging registries, patient registries and databases more so than we ever have before, in really a number of different ways. One way is to just understand where patients are as we open sites to have access and participation for patients broadly. Another is because the work that we do in learning from the data that exists in these registries is also quite essential, helping us understand endpoints, in particular, trying to drive towards non-invasive endpoints in a disease like PSC, still an area of significant amount of work in front of us. And, I think these databases and registries in particular can be an alternative way, for those, of course, that are participating in clinical trials, but even those that are not comfortable or not eligible in many cases for specific clinical trials. I think these surveys, patient registries, PRO experience, we all in the industry are gaining just a tremendous amount of knowledge from large sets of data that are gathered in these areas. And, folks here may know that in PBC, again, where we've been actively involved, large historical data sets were really critical in identifying non-invasive endpoints that could be surrogates and aid in clinical development. And so as these data sets increase in size in PSC, I think that's an essential area for those of us in industry to be able to learn from. So I think that you highlighted again here on this slide as an alternative way for many patients to be involved in what ultimately will aid in potential new treatment alternatives.
Right. And that whole issue of non-invasive tests and endpoints is just so important. And I think the whole field in liver diseases has learned so much from PBC and the natural history cohort and the ability through that data to hone in on a couple of biomarkers that were just very instrumental. Now with PSC, PBC is also a rare disease that also affects some of the same organ structures, the liver and biliary ducts, etc. But it is quite different. And although it is a rare disease, it's not as rare as PSC. So Dr. Pratt, coming back to you, with PSC being rarer than significantly rarer than PBC, and also the heterogeneity of the patient population. Those are additional challenges because all the data sets will be smaller, and because they're smaller, the heterogeneity will play a bigger role, right? So why is it so important to have all kinds of patients, every kind of patient involved in this kind of research?
Right. No, I think the things mentioned about the registry, and that is so essential. So as I meet with patients in clinic, beyond providing their clinical care, a lot of the discussion is focused on the role that research plays in their care as well. And as you say, the registries to me are essential because we see so much heterogeneity in PSC, from patients who seemingly don't progress much over time for reasons we don't understand to the ones who progress quite rapidly. And I think your point's well taken, Dr. Miller. If we don't have a large enough registry which encompasses all of these different parts of PSC, then any research becomes really a challenge. So as we're doing natural history studies, and certainly as we think about studying epigenetics and some of the other ways that we try to unravel this disease, having subsets of patients, whether it be small duct PSC or patients with varying clinical progression, that's the way we're going to learn. And it's only with these larger registries that we will have the resources we need to identify those subsets and hopefully manage them correctly. So your point's very well taken. That's absolutely true with a rare disease. We need the patients.
So within the participants of this webinar and the broader PSC community, I guess your message would also be that just because you don't have some of the symptoms that are frequently talked about or some of those findings, your data is still so valuable, right?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely.
And how do you find, just to probe this a little bit more as a clinical researcher, how do you find the acceptance of your patients to participate in a registry? Is it overall pretty positive, or do they like to hear from other patients or organizations like PSC Partners why this would be a good idea? Or how do you engage in that discussion, you and your team?
Yes, well, it's part of that whole initial clinic session, which we have very long meetings, and part of it is discussing what a registry means, whether it just be providing clinical data, whether it means also providing specimens, whether it be blood or tissue. And I find that in terms of involvement with registries, it's almost universal. It's very, very rare that I have someone who balks at that piece of it. And so that part's easy. I'm sure we'll get on to talking about clinical trials here in a moment. That could be a little more of a challenge. But the registries by themselves, I think patients get it when it's explained and they understand that having that data available to researchers and collaborators around the country, it can make all the difference in terms of us understanding the disease.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned clinical trials, so maybe we can kind of jump into that area a little bit. And of course, we want the diversity in the registries, but we also do want the diversity in the clinical trials. Yes. So, Sujal, as a developer in the cholestatic liver space and kind of understanding some of these challenges in heterogeneity, what are some of the approaches you and your colleagues in the company and other companies? We have so many companies represented here today that will also be part of the breakout groups. How can you, what are some of the challenges in increasing the diversity, the heterogeneity of the people participating in the clinical trials? We want the science to tell us something, but we don't want it to be so restricted that we then can't explain the results or translate the results to the wider population.
Yeah, this is an incredible challenge, and you and Dr. Pratt have hit on it in particular with respect to PSC. Often, as is the case, we're trying to see if the science with our potential treatment alternatives really translates in the clinic or not. And sometimes that does require an approach in which we need to try and identify some level of homogeneity in patient population sets before we start to expand across a more heterogeneous population. That's not uncommon at all. It's of course somewhat at odds with the long-term goal of treating the broadest patient population, but often that is the approach that's necessary, just to see if the science is translating or not in the clinic. Some of the challenge also becomes the fact that the patient numbers are small, and making decisions on relatively small data sets, is part of this challenge. I think this is where, again, registries and more data can be helpful. And obviously, just understanding how to evaluate and assess various endpoints is also key. You talk about PROs. Clearly in cholestatic liver disease like PSC, the goal is to improve long-term outcome for patients, but it's also to improve quality of life.
Right.
And often the PROs are essential to that. And I think regulators are becoming more and more attuned to the importance of quality of life indicators and clinical symptom burden in diseases like PSC. And so as we gather these data sets, as I mentioned, sometimes in the more narrow population, I think it's really incumbent, not so much on the patients, but those of us in industry to then make a commitment beyond just that more narrow patient population and really be committed to the patient population as a whole. But, often we're boxed in, at least initially, to try and generate some data set that's meaningful with relatively small patient numbers, and that often requires some level of homogeneity at the outset. I can assure you, though, that the incentives for those of us in industry are aligned with the broader patient population, which is to find opportunities in which our potential therapeutics can benefit, the most patients possible. Sometimes we also have to be disciplined in recognizing where that may not be the case. Our job is to not do any additional harm. And if we learn that there are some segments of the patient population that would be at greater risk, that's important knowledge for us to gain. And in some cases, it may restrict some of the work that folks do depending on their treatment alternatives. So, having an open mind from our standpoint is important. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to communication. I think the onus should be on industry to be very transparent with patients so that they have a better understanding. There is always sometimes these restrictions. We often see, patients who are ineligible for clinical studies based on entry criteria. That onus is on companies, I think, those of us in industry, to be able to at least explain and articulate, why the entry or exclusion criteria are the way they are. Oftentimes, they're a mix between, the development plan, but also regulatory guidelines. But once again, I put that onus on those of us in industry to be articulating that to patients that are being involved.
Right. Yeah, that is so important to really understand that, because when somebody does decide they want to participate in a clinical trial and then find that there's no trial that they can enroll in, that might be then disappointing as well. So Dr. Pratt, back to you then. In terms of clinical trials and recruiting patients into joining them, what can you tell us tonight about some new new findings? What's happening right now when you and your colleagues talk about new science and PSC? What gets you excited?
Oh, well, how much time do I have? There are a lot of interesting things. The way I sort of discuss this with my patients is there's such a variety of directions that we're going in terms of trying to treat the disease. What the challenge is since we don't really understand the disease to begin with, this becomes part of it, lots of theories and things like that. But there are all sorts of angles and they relate to the microbiome. You think about therapies that impact the microbiome. Oral vancomycin has been something which has captured people's attention for quite a while. We went so far as to do a fecal transplant trial in PSC, to things like the PPAR agonists, things like CymaBay, which has potentially made great sense as a potential therapy, and in PBC looks remarkably positive. So we're excited to see more of the PBC data. There are, one of the things which we've always struggled with is we know this is an immune-mediated disease, yet we've struggled mightily in trying to identify therapies that might be directed at the immune system. So I have a personal interest in understanding the epigenetics and trying to understand in PSC the role that they might play in terms of us trying to understand what therapies might benefit an individual patient. And,
right.
and I think for us, what we struggle with right now is we're trying a variety of different things without really fully understanding the cause of the disease. And so there's still much work to be done in our understanding of the disease to better tailor therapy. But in the meantime, very happy that we have companies that are trying to develop both those sorts of therapeutics, and then another big class, which is a bit different, is the ones that are looking at antifibrotics. And so ones which, if we can just identify a therapy which addresses the development of fibrosis, and one that might even stabilize fibrosis in PSC, my gosh, that would be quite amazing too. So there are all sorts of general areas that are being looked at. It's an exciting time. It wasn't so very long ago that we had very little to offer. And I feel like with some of the things that are coming along, both in translational research, also through the registries, but also looking at some of these potential therapeutic agents through the clinical trials that are happening, there are things going on. So it is for me, an exciting time in PSC.
So definitely a call to the community to be active and look out for what is happening and stay on top of new science. So I know it's the time is now to wrap up. So let me just briefly ask both of you again. I know we've emphasized this a lot already about this community learning, how we all learn from each other. But as you ask your patients to participate in these various studies, and some of them give tissue and liver biopsy and participate, and things like you said, the microbiome studies, etc. Talk a little bit about the respect for patients and their data, and also listening to the patients about how their data are used, not just for one study, but really to inform the whole field. Sujal, if you could just make some comments in that regard, and then I'll ask Dr. Pratt to finish up as well, and then we'll hand it back to the PSC partner host.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I think once again, the responsibility in terms of how patient data is used lies on those of us running these clinical trials. Much of it is regulated, but fundamentally, it's still up to, I think, our industry to better communicate with those that are involved in our studies and the means that are appropriate and possible. You know, we form partnerships with investigators, and the work we do with them is obviously essential. Those of us in industry should form those same types of partnerships with patients, and often the easiest way to do that is to do so through advocacy groups and through our support of advocacy groups and our interaction with them. And I think, you know, it's important for us to be able to highlight how data is used, how we respect patient data, privacy of patient data, and ultimately the decisions we make. We at CymaBay, as an example, and I know many of my colleagues really here on the line as well, you know, really believe it's our responsibility to publish and present data, whether it's good or bad. You know, that's again a responsibility we think on industry. We've had clinical studies not have the best data sets that we've published, that we've presented. You know, that's our commitment to patients as well, because obviously embedded in that work are patients that have really volunteered their time to participate in that fashion. And so, you know, I think these are the responsibilities for us to better communicate, to share these data sets broadly. We can't always do so individually. I think that's really up to the investigator with their relationship with their patient. But again, I think the responsibility is one in which all of us in industry carry to be able to share those learnings broadly with the medical community, and that's inclusive of patients.
Right. Great. Thank you so much. And I know why you were invited to participate tonight. It's just so insightful to hear your comments, Sujal. And then Pratt, back to you. Just a few closing comments along those lines of what you do with your registry data and really respecting the patient's contribution to that.
Yes, respecting it is absolutely right. So it's truly a privilege that the patients are willing to share what they share with us. And when I think of what they're willing to do in terms of samples and the way that we manage those samples is amazing. And I think with just a little bit of discussion and education, it goes a long way to them understanding that we are going to use these samples in ways that we think are meaningful and can really hopefully lead our understanding on. And they get that. And so it's a privilege and an honor to have access to patient data and patient samples, and we guard those very carefully in terms of.
Good. So I can't thank both of you enough for your very candid and honest talking about your perspective on this. And so, Joanne, I guess I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks,
to Ruthann.
This is Ruthann, yep. Thanks so much, Veronica, Sujal, and Dan, for such an eye-opening, educational, and important discussion. It's so apparent to us how much each of you care about the PSC community, and we appreciate all that you do. Welcome back, everyone. Now I'd like to introduce Rachel, PSC Partners Registry Director, for a few words.
Thank you, Ruthann. We very much hope that the Drug Development Roadmap webinar series has empowered you, PSC patients, to understand that you play a central role in the drug development process. Your participation, in turn, empowers us at PSC Partners to be strong advocates in the pursuit of treatments and a cure. One clear and simple way of contributing to drug development is to join the over 2,000 PSC patients who are in the PSC Partners Patient Registry. Your participation is also crucial in natural history studies. You've heard from Dr. Miller, Dr. Pratt, and Dr. Sujal Shah about their perspective, and ours is now the patient perspective. With a growing recognition of the importance of the patient voice in drug development, this is the time to get involved in pushing research forward. Drug developers and pharmaceutical companies embark in trials when they know that patient data and patients through the registry will learn about clinical trial opportunities and participate. And through your generous responsiveness, you provide us with your voice and with the power to expand interest in finding treatments for PSC. The PSC Partners Registry welcomes all PSC patients. In fact, that is one of the big strengths of the registry. PSC patients coming from small medical centers and rural areas that are not attached to major centers create a larger pool of patients for research and represent PSC patients at different disease stages. Next slide, please. Drug developers ready to start their clinical trials seek out PSC Partners because the registry provides an organized and accessible PSC community with searchable data. It also empowers PSC Partners to approach and encourage pharma that express interest in PSC. Through your information, you, the registry participant, provide us the tools with which to review clinical trial protocols and highlight areas that can be improved to make the trial as patient-friendly as possible. Thanks to your participation in the registry, pharma engages early with us in their clinical trial process. Through these relationships, we advocate for your needs and challenges, which you can communicate to us through surveys in the registry. The registry helps in recruitment for clinical trials. As a registry participant, you get to hear whether you might be eligible to join a clinical trial. We care deeply about the patient experience in clinical trials. We will support you as best as we can. Don't hesitate to reach to us. Thank you. Passing it to you, Ruthann.
Thanks, Rachel. So just a few updates. First of all, we have some big news to share. We know everyone's been wondering about the June conference for this year, 2022. The PSC Partners Annual Conference will meet virtually this year from June 2nd to 5th. This was a very painful decision for the PSC Partners Board of Directors and leadership. We really hope to see you all in person. However, out of an abundance of caution and care for the health and safety of everyone in our community, especially those who are immunocompromised, we've decided to transition the conference to a virtual gathering. We know that the COVID-19 situation is in constant flux, but in the wake of multiple COVID-19 variants and due to some contractual obligations with the hotel in Boston, it was necessary to make the decision at this time. A delay would have resulted in substantial financial penalties for PSC Partners. And as difficult as this decision is, we cannot in good conscience forfeit this community funding. And I know how disappointing this was. We developed the roadmap series in order to lead us into the conference. And I was really looking forward to meeting all of you in person. But here's what you can expect from the virtual PSC Partners Conference. The plans are in the works, and we'll have selective and engaging presentations on PSC and current research presented by international experts on PSC and PSC-related diseases, co-hosted with Brigham and Women's and Mass General Hospital at Harvard University. We'll have opportunities to ask questions and have conversations with experts in small breakout sessions. And there will be numerous chances to reconnect virtually with old and new friends from the PSC community during fun social events, engaging peer-to-peer sessions, small group chats, and more. We hope to see you all in attendance as we bring our community together for these important conversations, exciting research updates, and renewed connection via this interactive virtual platform. And one other quick highlight, in our new Community Connections video series, host and PSC patient Rob Matola spotlights different members of the PSC community. Visit our YouTube channel to view the first 2 interviews with PSC patients, Fred and Julianne. And please visit our website for more information about joining the PSC Patient Registry and Mentor Program, our monthly Living with PSC podcast, links to updated COVID-19 and vaccine information, and our COVID-19 infection survey, and to sign up for a mailing list and follow us on social media. We also have information about future Zoom rooms on our website and here on this slide.